And I am going to be recording this meeting so that those who aren't able to attend can still view it if needed. So let's go ahead and get started. So my name is Teresa McIntyre. I am currently the Assessment Development Coordinator. Before that, I was the Elementary Language Arts Assessment Specialist over Acadience Reading. My new person actually starts on Monday, so I'm super excited about that. Jared Wright is trying to join us. His computer is telling him there's a problem with his server. So if he's able to get on his computer, he will be joining us. And he is over our Acadience math, is the elementary math and science assessment specialist at USBE. So our learning intention today is the participant is learning how to analyze middle of year Acadience data. And so you are going to be analyzing that middle of year data, identifying areas of strength and growth, identifying underlying causes that could be impacting student achievement, and determining next steps. So we're going to be taking a look at a bunch of different data sets within ALO to help you make these decisions and think about student achievement. So Acadience has a outcomes-driven model, and they really want people to actually use that data. So we're looking at the middle of year as a time to identify need for additional support or different support, as well as reviewing outcomes of what's happened for that first half of the year, and then thinking about what could be changed for the future. So thinking about percentage of your students meeting benchmark goals, making typical or better growth, and which students may need support. So this composite score is the likelihood of success on future benchmarks. It helps us to know the type of support needed for students and which students should likely receive progress monitoring. It informs system level decisions when you're looking at that as a system versus just at that individual student level. So the first step we're going to do is we're going to take a look at our composite score data and really think about where are students at from the beginning of the year to the middle of the year. So when you're looking at that composite score data, we're putting in percent and then number of students. So at each of the levels. So we can see, looking at our graph for the beginning of the year, we had 29% and 28 students at the well below benchmark. And then we can fill in our below benchmark, at benchmark, and above benchmark data. And then it is asking you to add up. What percent of students are below or well below? What percent of students are at or above? And so we're going to fill that information out for the beginning of the year. And then same thing, now we're going to do that middle of the year analysis and look at what are the numbers like now at that middle of the year. So you can see overall the percentage changed to more students below or well below 2% change. Possibly it could be impacted by the fact there were only 97 students at the beginning of the year and 100 at the middle of the year. Those 3 students that came in could have moved some of those numbers potentially. It's not a huge significance difference. And so if I were looking at this, I would say we're pretty close to being exactly the same at the beginning of the year as we are in the middle of the year with our composite scores. We didn't see a growth and change with our well below or below benchmark students moving up. And that's where I would look at this and think, okay, we're not moving those students up. And that's a problem because in order to close that achievement gap for students, we've got to move our well below and below benchmark students. But our above and at benchmark students have been maintained because they're pretty much exactly the same. And so I can at least feel like core instruction is working for students. So when we're looking at our overall composite data, we're thinking about that core instruction element and maintaining students at that at and above benchmark level. And yes, I am happy to share my slides. I did have a few people join, so let me drop the participants notebook in the chat. Please make a copy, or if you want to analyze both reading and math data, please make 2 copies. Questions about analyzing that composite score data. This is really looking at core instruction. We're not thinking about interventions at this point. That's going to be another data set that we're going to look at. So for my recommendation for looking at composite score reports is that you pull up in ALO in the student list view with that green drop-down arrow, look at ALO benchmark overview and then select to print it. If you select to print it, it's then going to show you the little rainbows with the percentages and the number of students at each level. The benchmark overview is going to show you composite score with all of the different submeasures below it for each individual grade. You'll just want to be looking at that composite score for each grade, so you'll just have to scroll down to the next page. My recommendation is choose to print it, save it as a PDF for yourself, and then pull it up as you're doing this analysis of the composite score data. If you still use ADM for math, which is not very many, you're going to be looking at that ADM status report. So ALO, that benchmark overview. So this is your chance to go to pull that up right now. And then we're going to take some time to actually look through that data and figure out some percentages and numbers of students and think about what does our composite score data look like in comparison to the beginning of the year. As we're going throughout our session, please, if you have questions, drop them in the chat. I do have the chat open. I am monitoring it. If you want to come off mute and ask a question, you are also welcome to do that. This is going to, if you're at your student list view of all of the students in your school, or if you're looking at LEA level, it's going to be big. And then you're going to go to the green drop-down arrow over on the right side of the screen and select benchmark overview. So you want to make sure all grades are selected so that it's going to bring up the data for all of the grades that you want to look at. Okay, so we're going to give you 20 minutes to complete this composite score analysis and looking at your data. So it's on pages 1 through 4 of your participant's notebook. Yep, let me pull up the Acadience site. Just a minute. Okay, so if you are at the main dashboard, you're going to select My District. Choose, you're going to end up with the schools. Choose the school that you want, or you may just default into a school. Then you're going to make sure you select students. Just a little bit bigger. Then you're going to come over to the right side with the green drop-down arrow and select Benchmark Overview. This is then going to show you the reading composite data along with all of the measure level data. You can see this by district. So as you are doing the benchmark overview, go up to the print button on your browser, select print, and then it's going to bring up the information with the percentages and the number of students within each thing. So you could just save this and then use this as a reference for yourself as you're filling out the data. If you want to look at this at a district level view, you can go into the whole district. So right now I'm in test district A. I have 569 students. I select students and I can go and do the same thing and select the benchmark overview. Yes, you would just be recording the grade level, not the individual classes. So this is overall looking at the system as a whole and as grade levels. If there are concerns with the data, you may dive into it at a class level, but this is looking at it at the bigger lens of a whole grade of in a school or a whole grade within an LEA. Anybody else need help figuring out how to find the data? Yes, so you can either hover over it or you can go up to the print. And that's my recommendation is when you're at that report for the benchmark overview, go to the print in your browser window, and then it's going to bring up a PDF. And then it's going to have the numbers and the percentages in that PDF. This is going to take a long time because it's 15 pages. Um, and then you can just save that PDF and use that rather than the live version on the screen. It's a lot faster if you print it out for yourself. Okay, that was 20 minutes. We're not going to take time right now to analyze the data. We're going to go ahead and go on to our next data set, and then we have a set of questions that we will use to analyze the data, looking at our composite score data, as well as the next data set that we're going to look at. So, Jared, I stopped sharing, so you can now share. He made it. His computer obviously started working, and so he's going to take over this next section.
Yeah, hopefully you can see why I look at effectiveness.
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, my computer, it felt a bit like a Monday. I wanted to not log me in and then update everything. So just 1 second while I'm trying to get my tools set up. All right. Okay, so we'll go through why look at effectiveness. So there's going to be another report that we look at, and it is called the Effectiveness of Instructional Support. And this report is going to look at the three areas, and you can see them on the slide. So you have the core instruction, strategic support, and intensive support. And as a reminder, core instruction is, well, it's on all students, but as far as the needs, students who are at or above benchmark, core instruction should be enough to help them continue to make progress throughout the year. And then you have strategic and intensive support, and those would be connected with students who scored below or well below the benchmark. They need that strategic or intensive support. And so in this report, the effectiveness of instructional support, we're looking at how did the students score at the beginning of the year and where are they at now at the middle of the year. So this is a report that isn't available at the beginning of the year, but it becomes available at the middle and the end of the year once you have multiple points of benchmark data. So some guidelines, and this is in the participants guide that hopefully you've made a copy. It's on page 5. The slide doesn't have, well, it has it in italicized, but here's the page, and it has it bolded. And as far as these guidelines, and we'll just walk through those. But I did want to call your attention to essentially what this is all saying is there's a sentence down here in the note that says if you are moving 80 to 100% of your below or well below students up and maintaining those at or above benchmark level, then your instruction is effective. So really that's the key. So there's all these numbers, but the idea is that you're moving a large majority of your students up levels so that the students are going to have more success in future benchmarks. So let's go back to this. So the first one is 80% of students are reaching benchmark with just the core instruction. Now, this may not be happening. This is ideal. And so if that's not the case, then you're thinking about how can I maybe tweak my core instruction to be able to address a lot of the instructional needs as a whole class rather than creating a whole bunch of small groups. And then you can see 95 to 100% who score at or above at the beginning of the year, they score at or above at the middle of the year. So they're not dropping down. We're keeping them scoring at the level that they scored at the beginning of the year. And then number 3, we're moving students who are below or well below that 3 and 4. We're moving those students up. Now, ideally, you want them at or above. And but as long as we're moving them up and they're increasing their skill level, uh, that's a positive. And that's where growth will come into play with pathways of progress, which Teresa will talk about later. So just some guidelines here as you're working with teachers to try and help students improve their skills. And I will say something I thought about with this as I thought about this slide, and there was a question about does this apply to reading or math or math? So all of this that we're going through applies to reading and math. It's the same functionality and reports as you go through. But one difference might be as you look at this effectiveness of instructional support, thinking about with math, progress monitoring is optional. So is it even happening? Is progress monitoring and small group instruction happening for math? If it's not, then that's something that you kind of back up and start there. So we're going to have you look at the data. So you can see at the top, this is what it's going to look like. And it can be a little confusing right at the first as you look at this report. So the report is just this screenshot right at the top. The bottom section with the text is the tables that you have in the participant notebook that you'll utilize as you look at the data. So along the top, these pill-shaped things, you have well below, below, at, and above. So students who, it creates kind of this cohort of students. So students who were at the beginning of the year scored well below. It looks at, okay, how did they do at the middle of the year? And as I look at that, I can see there were 149 students that fell into that well below benchmark category at the beginning of the year. Now, where are they? Well, 116 are still well below. 14 have moved up to below. 11 have moved to at, and then 8 have moved to above benchmark. And it distributes how those that cohort of students have done at the middle of the year. And you can see that for each of these. So looking at above benchmark, there were 102 at the beginning of the year, and now I can see, okay, how did those distribute at the middle of the year? Well, 7 went to well below, and then all the way up. So as
Jared,
you look at that,
if you press enter, it will bring up the data.
perfect. Oh, there we go.
Sorry, these were my slides originally, and he was going to do the first set, but then he couldn't get on, and so we ended up switching.
Yeah, the secret code here. All right. Thank you. All right, so there's the information there. So you would look at the data and then you can enter that information in the table. Now I'll show you, Angela, where this is. But I do want to bring up one thing that you'll notice here. You'll see these percentages and you'll see the numbers next to like the N size, how many students are in each of those categories. When I bring up well, I'll go through it now. Let's just go there. So this is in ALO, this is what it looks like. And you'll notice that in ALO, it had those rainbow things, and then next to it were the percentages and the number of students in each category. Initially, because of the design of their system, you have to hover over it. So let me go to that and just show you. So on your dashboard, when you're at the dashboard, and I selected math just because I'm more familiar with it, but you have the benchmark assessments at the top, and then the center, this middle report is the effectiveness of instructional support. You'll notice as I'm going over, I can kind of hover and I start to see some numbers. So it's designed to be more interactive. However, if I want it so that I have those numbers in a hard copy, I can just I can go to it and print, and then it comes up with those numbers. It prints those percentages and numbers next to it. So I can either hover and get those percentages, and I'm at a state level right now, so it's big numbers, but I can hover over this, or I can choose to print it and have the numbers next to it, similar to let's go back, similar to what this had, where you have this percentage and you have the number of students next to it. So whatever is easiest for you as you're looking at the data, feel free to go through that.
It will only let you print it for one grade level at a time, though. So the last report, I was able to show you that you could print it out, so all the grades were there. This will only print one grade at a time. So you'd have to select kindergarten, then you could choose to print it, or hover, and then you select first grade and you can print or hover.
Thank you. Yeah. So this is kindergarten, and then I would have to go through it that way. Thank you. And this all begins on page 6, depending on what grade you're selecting to go through. We have that information that you can look at. All right, let's go to, and then if you're using ADM, it looks a little bit different with the pie charts, but it functions the same way, where you have the cohort of students at the top row, and then below that is how it distributes how those students did at the middle of the year. So we're going to give you some time to go through and look at this data. So, as Teresa mentioned, select a grade. If you want to go through multiple grades, that's great. We'll give you the 20 minutes. Are there any questions before we jump in and go through the effectiveness of instructional support?
So I have a question. Mine is set on district. How do I just take and do by grade level for just a certain school?
So do you have this my districts at top?
Yes.
Oh, dang it. I could, let's see. Let me go back, sorry. And my computer's acting. To the left, while my computer's trying to figure out itself, to the left are some little lines that you can filter. If you click on those, it brings up, oh, here we go. So these little lines to the left, then I can go to schools or classes, and I can filter down.
Yeah, I don't see those little lines there.
These little filters over here. Another option would be to click on let's see.
It has like each school. Maybe if I click on the school,
Yeah,
and then
click on this.
Then I'll look for the arrows.
I think you're in the wrong view. So click on the A in the upper right corner. You want to click on that A.
Left corner.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Left corner. Click on the A, and that's going to bring you up to the main dashboard view.
Okay,
then you'll see the little filters.
Okay.
You can select a specific school. You'll also see the effectiveness of instructional support in the middle. So if you were on the My District page with the student list view, you can't see this report. So,
yep.
So that's what it was. There.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Yeah. Any other questions? Angela, as far as finding the report, tell me what
I think she was probably not on the A as well, because we had just gone into the My District view. So I think people just needed to get back to the selecting that A.
Yeah. Okay, great. As with the past activity, Grace and I are here to answer questions as you're looking at the data. Feel free to reach out as we go through this. I didn't start the timer, so hopefully maybe it's more like 22 minutes. Is that the slide? I think that's the example slide that's requested. Perfect.
Can I just ask a question in ALO instead of typing it off?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so looking under effectiveness of instructional support. So I am looking at kindergarten right now. So the 4 rainbows under there, if I like to look at the percentage that stayed in red, do I go like just, I don't know, there's like a number. So there's 14 under the rainbow in the well below. And then it says 7. So from beginning to middle, 7 stayed in red. Is that correct?
Yeah, so if I'm looking at this in my example here,
Let me look.
so in this example, there were 149 who were scored red, well below at the beginning of the year. At the middle of the year, there's 116 or 78% who scored red at the middle of the year.
Oh,
Out
you
of
went to
that,
the print. You're at the print version, right?
yeah, let's go back to the hover. So if I'm hovering,
Okay, that's what mine looks like. Okay.
so I can see at the bottom are so
Yeah.
this just shows me, yeah, number of students and then percentage.
Okay. I got it. It's just I was not in the print screen, and so I thought it was at the wrong place.
Oh, okay. No,
Okay, thank you.
yeah, you're welcome. All right. That's our timer, 10:15 now. So finish what you're working on there, and then we will move on to the next bit of information. But before we do that, any questions up to this point as far as composite scores, effectiveness of instructional support, or anything else that's come to mind as you've looked at the data? Just take a moment and think about that. We're just giving a little bit of time to focus on any questions you might have.
I have a question about the literacy.
Sure. Yeah, definitely.
So, like, it's difficult, well, even in math, sometimes when kids move, especially middle of year, so in literacy, how oral reading fluency is added, so a lot of them do drop. And then same thing in math, well, more towards the end of the year, as different subtests within are added or taken away, then sometimes it looks really drastic when admin looks at it. And what's a great way to explain that it's not testing exactly the same thing in some of the lower grades?
Yeah, I think that's really important to look at. I know for first grade, I'll talk from math point of view. First grade, beginning of the year, you have a bunch of tests, 4, I think, and then come to the middle of the year, then you end up with 2. Several of those have dropped off. Another example would be if I am teaching kindergarten at the beginning of the year to middle of the year, there is quite a large jump in expectations for scores to be at or above benchmark. So I think it's really important I think that's where this effectiveness of instructional support, and also as we look at the pathways of progress, but paying attention to not only just the scores, but thinking about what kind of change has happened from beginning to middle and then to end as well. So I don't know that there's a good way other than to be aware that that's a possibility, and to go through that there are different things impacting maybe the changes. Because if I'm a first grade teacher and my students, you almost have the opposite sometimes, but maybe my students did really well at the early numeracy tests that they take at the beginning of the year, and then they're not even tested on those at the middle of the year. And so that, their best scores were done at the beginning of the year, and now they're learning and coming along, and those scores may drop. So I think it's also important to recognize, in my opinion, and what I understand for this measure, at least from the math, is this is a screener to flag whether students might need some extra support in certain skills to be able to reach the next benchmark, or have a better probability to reach that benchmark coming up. I don't know if that helps. That's my thought. If anyone else has thoughts on how they express or help in sharing why changes might happen.
Jared, I will just add, as far as looking or thinking specifically about the literacy, is that Acadience has that big shift actually in the middle of first grade to moving from just being able to read nonsense words to reading connected text, because students should be able to read connected text at the middle of first grade. And if they can't, then we need to look at what is happening in the classroom to get them to be able to do that. So it is looking at potential risk for students that if they're not able to read connected text by the middle of first grade, then they're behind, and we need to now provide some interventions for them so that they can be reading connected text by the end of first grade and going into second grade. And we do see a lot of schools where students do drop in that middle of first grade because they're not getting into connected text soon enough, whether that's because it's the program that they're using, for instruction that doesn't get them into connected text soon enough, whether teachers are maybe providing so much support that students don't actually have to read on their own at all, or that they're spending more time on the phonics and phonemic awareness pieces, which are still important, and not getting into that connected text and actually having students read. And I've participated in doing lots of observations around the state, and we do see that students aren't getting into actual reading in that first grade space, which then causes scores to drop at the middle of the year as they're being assessed on reading connected text. So I would really look at, like, if you do see this big drop, what's happening at that beginning of the year, first half of the year in first grade classes, and how much time are students actually spending reading connected text, not having teachers read the text to them, but actually reading it themselves, and take a look at what's happening in that core instruction. That's what that composite score really is designed to do, is to look at what's happening within core instruction. Are we maintaining our students? And then the effectiveness is really, it helps to look at our benchmark and above benchmark students too, but really looking at that below and well below benchmark students, are they getting moved up because we're providing specific interventions for them, and is that making the difference and moving them up to where they need to be?
Thanks, Teresa. Any other questions? Okay, we will go through. So now we're going to look. This is an example. If you've gone through the training with Acadience, they utilize this model. It says reading here. It also applies to math, but so you have the model where you're focusing on, you start at that identify need for support at the top, and then you circle down, and then depending on what the needs are for the student, you jump into progress monitoring, and then you come back out as far as reviewing outcomes and identifying need for support again and going through that process. So now we're going to jump into, looking at some of the potential causes, and I know this also has stuff that I can click on. So looking, you have this on page 14 of the participant notebook, and if you've made copies, you can either write there or type or add to it, but there might be some things as you're looking at the data that you'll want to consider as to essentially that discussion we just had. Like you're noticing there's some differences in the scores as you're looking at the composite score, as you're looking at effectiveness of instruction, and the discussion we had as far as Teresa bringing up reading connected text, that might be connected with some of the, whether that's the instruction or assessment practices, what's going on that's a little might be impacting that student achievement. So going back to our participant notebook, if we go down, sorry for all the scrolling. On page 14, we have a little bit more information, some questions that connect with each of those big areas. So we're going to take some time and just think about the data you've looked at, and are there things within each of these categories that might be affecting why the scores are looking the way they are? We'll take 10 minutes for that. And I'll always feel free to ask any questions as you're reviewing and reflecting on the data.
There was a request in the chat to open up some breakout rooms because there was a few people who would like to go into breakout rooms. So what I'm going to do is just open up a few breakout rooms. And if you want to go into a breakout room, you are welcome to, or you can just analyze on your own.
Marisa, I think if you're trying to talk, you're on mute.
That's right. I opened everything else up and did not unmute myself. So I started the recording again, opened everything up. Sorry. Thank you, Jared. So we're going to take a look at proficiency and growth. So this chart, we currently have three quadrants right here. We can see we have low growth and low proficiency. So those are our students that we're going to be the most concerned about. They started with low growth and they are not making growth. And their proficiency is low. Students who have low growth, but a high proficiency, those could be your highly skilled learners, or students who are at or above benchmark, but are still not making very much growth. We do want to intervene for those students because if they don't make at least typical growth, we are going to see them dropping and end up being in that low growth, low proficiency range. For students who have a low proficiency, so they're below or well below benchmark, but they are making high growth, those students are closing that achievement gap. And so we can be confident that they are on a good trajectory. Ultimately, we want students who have both a high growth and a high level of proficiency. That means that they are making huge gains and really gaining those literacy or math skills. So for the state goal for math, we did have one for literacy before, but with some board rule changes, that is no longer in place. So there is still a state growth goal for math that 60% of students in grades 1 through 3 will achieve typical or better growth. So we did include the highly skilled learner criteria information on page 14 in your packet. And if a student meets this qualification and does not make typical growth, ALO puts a little asterisk next to their pathway and then shows the pathway as making typical growth. So if the student is highly skilled learner but makes typical or better growth, they don't provide an asterisk because they have not changed the data in any way. So that little asterisk is just your signal that their actual pathway data has changed and been changed to typical growth so that they can be counted in that way as that highly skilled learner. So the Pathways of Progress formula, you're really looking at your numerator is the number of students making typical or better progress, and denominator is their total number of students with a pathway achieved. You divide that numerator by the denominator, and that's going to give you your percent. The easiest way to do this is to go into your ALO and look at your student list view. Select the little filter icon next to the pathways. So it's those three little lines. You're going to want to select all the pathways because that's going to provide you with students who actually have a pathway. So they were there at the beginning of the year, they're there at the middle of the year, and they have a pathway score. If you just use all students to begin with, you'll definitely be including some students who don't have a pathway score and they shouldn't be included in your calculation. So if you select all the little filters, it's going to provide you with a number. So look over there at your students and so look at what that number is. That's going to become your denominator. Then you're going to change that filter and take off your below and well below typical progress and leave it with just the green and blue fans. And that's going to give you a different number. And that's going to become your numerator. Then you can divide your numerator by your denominator and get your percent. So that's going to be using that ALO pathways column. And for ADM, it would be your export, your benchmark scores is going to give you your pathways. There is information on pages 20 and 21 of the steps that I just went through in your participants notebook. So at the very end that you can utilize. And so we're going to give you 15 minutes to just look at what percent of students are making typical or better progress. And that's on page 18 in your participants notebook. Questions about calculating that pathways for looking at typical or better growth? Cassie, to answer your question, I would not factor a student who does not have a beginning of the year score. So when the state is looking at those percentages, they do not include students who don't have a BOY to EOY score at your school. So that's why the directions say to select all the pathways to begin with. That eliminates any students from your denominator that don't actually have a pathway, and they won't be included in your calculation. And then tick off and just select the typical and above to figure out that second, the numerator number. Cassie, I'm not sure what FAY means. Oh,
Full academic year, I think.
yeah, if they don't have a BOY score, they won't even get a pathway. So you can't, there's nothing to calculate for them. So when the state runs the data, they can only include students who actually have a pathway in the calculation. Yes, Omar, I would subtract students who did not take the BOY who do not have that. So if you go in and look at the directions on page 20 in your participants notebook, or just at the very end, it will indicate that you should select all pathways, which will eliminate students who don't have a pathway score. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and move on. The next thing we're going to look at is the effectiveness growth. So this is the same report that we just looked at for looking at effectiveness of instruction. And now we're going to look at it through the lens of growth. So if you go into the effectiveness of instruction report, so let me pull this up. You're going to head back over, select this A. Oh, it locked me out. I was gone for too long. Okay, I will come back to that in just a second. When you go to this effectiveness and you select the growth, you're going to see little fans instead of rainbows. And the fans are referring to your growth of those students. So it works the exact same way. We have a well below benchmark. So where were our students? We had 21 students at the beginning of the year at a well below benchmark level. And now where are they? And this time we're not looking at typical or better growth. We're looking at above typical or better growth, because for our students who are at a below or well below benchmark level, they have to make above or well above typical growth in order to be closing that achievement gap. If they continue to just make typical growth, they are on the same trajectory as the other students, and they stay just as far behind. They've gained skills, but not enough to close that achievement gap and get closer to that benchmark level. So for this, when we're looking at our below or well below benchmark students, we're looking to see, did they make above typical or better growth? And then did they make typical or below that growth? So looking at this data, we can see we've got 12 students that made above typical or better growth. So we were looking at the dark green and the blue. And then we can see we had 9 students who made only typical or below growth. So that's the red, yellow, and the light green. So we had 58% who were making above typical or better growth and 42% that were making typical or below growth. So those students, those 9 students, are not on a trajectory to start closing that achievement gap and to get themselves closer to benchmark. So those 9 students are the students we're really going to want to look at what is happening with those students. Now, a lot of you may have populations where a lot of students are at that well below benchmark level, and they may not have made a lot of growth, especially when you start looking at your 3rd grade and up. It's a lot harder to close that achievement gap. It's a lot harder to move students up a level in half a year. In kindergarten and even in first grade, it's a lot easier to close that achievement gap and move students up a level, a benchmark level in a half a year. Second, definitely third and above, it gets a lot trickier. So this is really where you can look at to see, are we helping our students to make enough growth to start closing that achievement gap, especially in those higher grades. So for looking at this well below benchmark students, we have 42% who are not on a trajectory to start closing that achievement gap. So that would be a concern. And I would want to have my teachers dive into those students more in depth and really look at what is happening and why are they not making the progress and what can we do and change to help them increase their growth, which then is going to get them closer to being at benchmark. Looking at the below benchmark students, I can add up my dark green and my blue, and I've got 18 students, which is 69%. And then add up the light green, yellow, and red, which is 8 students and 31%. So we're doing a little better on our below benchmark students. We have more of them that are making that above typical or better growth and closing that achievement gap. But I would still want my teachers to take a look at those 8 students and what can we do? What can we change? Because interventions aren't working well enough to start closing that achievement gap for them. Especially your students who are making that below and well below typical growth. Now I got logged back in. Let me show you what it looks like in ALO. So make sure you've selected this A. I can go down here to my effectiveness of instruction. I'm going to select the little pathways icon. And it's now going to show me the data with the fans. And I can then look at where students are. So this does not have a ton of data. I think first grade has more. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so I can now look at it. So for
Teresa,
kindergarten,
sharing didn't change. We're still looking at the slides.
Yeah.
oh, thank you. Typically it does.
Yeah, it's showing that effectiveness growth slide.
Okay, there, can you see it now?
I can see it.
Okay. There we go. Thank you. So when you're in this effectiveness of instructional support, so it's selecting that little A again, you come over and select this pathway icon at the end on the very right, and it's going to change it to looking at your pathway. So we can see we had 105 students at well below benchmark at the beginning of the year. And then we're looking to see we had 27 well above typical progress and 15 who had above typical progress. So we can put those two numbers together, and that's going to go on the side of above typical or more progress. So those students are closing the achievement gap. And then we can see the rest of them are not, and we can add those students together. So you might want to take the time to do print report because it's then going to provide you with that percent and easier to add it up when it's just sitting there. Or you can just do this and then go to your next grade and pull up your data for your next grade and look at the data by grade. Either way, whatever you find works best for you. Okay. Go back to so like I said, this report is super valuable in thinking about how students are growing, and especially your most at-risk students. So we're going to give you time to go ahead and complete this and take a look at your different grade levels and the level of growth. When you get to that benchmark or above benchmark, notice that the headings change, and then you're looking at typical or better growth is fine for benchmark or above benchmark students, and you're looking just at the percent that made below growth. Any questions about this effectiveness pathways? Yes, Rachel, that's correct. So when you're calculating for the state's growth, they're looking at typical or better, and they're not looking at the subgroups of students. When you're looking at below or well below benchmark students, you want to just count the dark green and the blue because that means they're closing that achievement gap and they're getting closer to being at that below or benchmark level just when you're evaluating that well below or below benchmark students' growth. Couple of questions in the chat. When you're looking at this information, you want to make sure you've selected on the pathways beginning of year. This is a demo site and it defaults to end of year, but you should have middle of year on yours. So beginning of year over on the very left, and then middle of year in the middle. And then if you want to just look at one LEA, if you select the filter icon right here, you can then go select a school. And change it to a specific school. You guys are welcome. Okay. I know that wasn't quite the full amount of time, but we only have 5 minutes left, and I do want to just make sure that we get to the last section. We think we always time things well, and then sometimes it just doesn't happen. So you probably haven't finished evaluating that growth piece, but I want to just take a few minutes to think about reflecting on that growth. So depending on your student population, that growth piece may be more important than looking at the actual composite and benchmark scores, especially for your upper grades. So I highly encourage you to have your teachers take a look at that growth for students. So they do have access to this effectiveness of instruction report and really have them think about the growth that students are making. For years, a lot of people thought that green at benchmark meant great and students were exactly where they needed to be. And now we know that really, if we want them to be proficient comprehenders, and successful on our RISE assessment, that they need to be at that above benchmark level, and that they need to be at that above benchmark level so that there's a much smaller chance of them actually falling behind in the future. It's the same thing with growth. We've thought typical growth is good, and that's what we need to aim for is typical growth. But for our below and well below benchmark students, we need to be aiming for above typical growth, or they're not going to ever reach that benchmark level. So on page 19 in your participants notebook are some questions to think about in reflecting on the overall pathway that analysis that you did in looking at typical or better growth, as well as looking at that effectiveness growth report and thinking about the implications that this has for your tier 1, 2, and 3 instruction, and thinking about those next steps in ensuring that students are making the growth that they need to make, especially our most at-risk students, to close that achievement gap. So we're not going to have time for you to do that data analysis today, but please make sure that you take that time, whether it's that you sit at your desk for another 15 minutes and finish that data analysis and then think about that pathways of progress. And then I just encourage you to think about how to present this to your staff and have them look at their individual classes and dive down to that individual student level and thinking about the increases or not increases we're seeing in students' achievement, as well as that growth level that students are at. And that's the trajectory that they are on. But middle of year means that you have time to change that trajectory. It's not a set in stone pathway. This is the trajectory they're on with the level of growth they'd made from the middle or from the beginning to the middle of the year. This is the growth level they're going to achieve by the end of the year. But you can change that by providing additional instruction or looking at like what is happening with that student and making changes at this middle of the year so that you don't have students that aren't making the progress they need to make. So I'm going to drop in the chat a form. Please fill that out. It will provide you with a certificate for attending today, as well as if you registered in Midas, that will use that form to provide you with that hours in Midas for attending. So thank you. Please reach out. We are happy to answer questions if you have questions. Oh, and I did promise the slideshow in the chat, so let me grab that. There is a link to the actual slides if you would like those.